They still speak of that day in whispers, as if the mere act of remembering might call it back from whatever realm it came from. It was the spring of 1876, in a small, wind-brushed settlement called Olympia Springs, deep in the Kentucky wilderness. The air was cool that morning, a thin mist crawling low over the rolling fields, carrying the smell of damp earth and distant woods. Farmers rose early, as they always did, to tend to their stock, mend fences, and greet the slow unfurling of daylight. But on that day, the dawn brought something else, something that would leave the town forever stained with dread. At first, it came as a sound, faint and almost delicate, like the soft patter of rain on a tin roof. Then, there was the smell, sharp, metallic, and wrong. The people who were outside that morning would later describe it in halting words, a taint that curled in the nose and clung to the tongue, a scent so heavy it seemed to press upon the chest. The sky above, pale and cloudless moments before, began to darken with drifting shapes. There were not birds, nor insects, nor anything the townsfolk had seen before. And then, as if some unseen hand had torn open the heavens, the meat began to fall. Thin strips at first, fluttering like autumn leaves, tumbling end over end through the air. Then thicker, wetter pieces, marbled flesh, streaked with veins, clumps that struck the earth with a sodden thud. They landed on rooftops, in water troughs, across the fields where children had been playing moments earlier. Some were as small as a coin, others as large as a man's hand. The people froze, their voices caught somewhere between disbelief and horror. One woman, Mrs. Eliza Barnett, would later swear she saw a piece fall directly into the open palm of her husband, who stood staring at it as though he had been presented with an unholy gift. No one moved to collect it, at least not at first. They stood in the open, watching the sky surrender its grotesque bounty, the pieces drifting down in slow arcs. The sound of it was unlike anything one could forget: soft impacts on wooden porches, splashes in the rain barrels, the occasional slap as a piece struck bare skin. It lasted only a matter of minutes, though to those who were there, it seemed an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, the rain of flesh ceased. The sky was once more an innocent blue, the mist burned away by the rising sun, as though the morning had been no different from any other. But the ground told another story. The fields were littered with it. Strips of muscle, slick with a faint sheen, glistened in the early light. Some bore a texture like that of beef, others were pale, with a spongy grain more akin to fish. The dogs of the town were the first to react, racing from one piece to another, snapping them up before their owners could intervene. A few bold men gathered samples, laying them on rough cloths to be examined later, while others crossed themselves and muttered that this was a sign or warning from above, though none could agree on the nature of the offense that had called it down. The event spread quickly by word of mouth, carried by travelers and traders who passed through. Soon, the newspapers got hold of it. Headlines spoke of the meat shower of Bath County with equal parts fascination and unease. Editors demanded explanations, but no one had one to give. There were theories, of course, wild, tangled stories about birds dropping their kills, or tornadoes lifting slaughterhouse remains from faraway places. But those who were there knew these explanations didn't fit. The pieces were too fresh, too varied, and too human. Not in form, that was the strangest part, but in essence, the texture, the smell, the unsettling warmth of it in the hand. It suggested something that had once lived and breathed in a way uncomfortably close to the townsfolk themselves. A doctor from the next county over was summoned to examine the remains. He arrived 2 days later, by which time the samples had begun to sour, their edges curling and darkening. In his report, he described the flesh as muscular tissue, bearing the characteristics of mammalian origin, though he could not or would not specify the species. His words did nothing to soothe the unease. If anything, they deepened it. For days afterward, the town could not shake the smell. Even those who scrubbed their porches until the wood grain bled claimed they caught whiffs of it in the breeze. The rain barrels had to be emptied and refilled. The fields were picked clean, though no one was certain it was wise to remove every trace. The children were kept inside, and the church bells rang more often than usual, calling the people to pray for deliverance from whatever had chosen them for this visitation. But some did not pray. Some, quietly, kept their pieces of meat, storing them away in jars of brine, or drying them over slow fires, as if the substance might hold some strange value or power yet to be understood. It was in these small acts, these private preservations of the impossible, that the first true fracture appeared in the soul of Olympia Springs. Because while most wanted to forget, a few could not let go. And it would be these few who, in the weeks to come, would find themselves staring into the darker heart of the mystery, where the answer waited, patient and hungry. In the days that followed, Olympia Springs moved like a town in mourning, though no one could quite name what they had lost. The streets were quieter, the tavern less raucous, the church pews more crowded on Sundays. The meat had vanished from the fields either, taken by scavengers, consumed by animals, or disposed of by cautious hands, but its memory hung over the town like an invisible shroud. The children whispered about it under their quilts at night, imagining it had come from monsters in the clouds. The older folk, however, carried the weight differently. They knew enough of the world to fear what could not be explained. Among them was a man named Elijah Rourke, a veteran of the war, his left arm stiffed from an old musket ball lodged near the bone. He had seen battlefields after the smoke cleared, and the sight of flesh torn from bone was no stranger to him. Yet the rain of meat had unsettled him in a way no cannon fire ever had. The smell had lingered in his nostrils, and in his dreams he saw the strips falling in slow motion, blotting out the sun, the earth opening to swallow them whole. Elijah kept one piece for himself, drying it on the mantel above his hearth. He told his neighbors it was so he could show his grandchildren proof of the day the sky bled. But in truth, he was waiting for something, though he could not have said what. Then there was Margaret Cole, the widow who lived in the old clapboard house by the creek. Margaret had always been seen as a pious woman, but her eyes carried the kind of hunger no scripture could satisfy. She too had kept a peace, though she had gone further than Elijah. She salted it carefully, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a cedar box beneath her bed. At night, she would take it out, hold it close to her face, and breathe deeply, as though inhaling some secret only she could detect. She began to dream more vividly after that, dreams of a great, dark plain stretching beyond the horizon, where the air was thick and red, and the ground was soft beneath her feet. By the end of the second week, talk began to circulate of strange happenings. Cattle grew restless at night, lowing in the dark until their owners came to calm them. A litter of piglets was found dead in its pen, their bodies unmarked, their eyes glassy as if drowned. One farmer swore that the trees at the edge of his land had begun to lean inward, their branches reaching toward the house like grasping hands. These stories were told in low tones at the tavern, quickly followed by mutterings that it had brought more than just meat. Elijah was the first to notice the flies. At first, they seemed no different from any others, few black specks humming lazily in the sun. But soon they grew in number, clustering on windowsills and doorframes, their wings beating in restless rhythm. When Elijah swatted one, its body burst with a smell, so foul it made his eyes water. Inside, instead of the pale pulp of an insect, there was something stringy, fibrous-like a sliver of boiled sinew. Margaret, meanwhile, claimed she had been visited in the night. She told no one at first, but the marks on her windowsill were plain to see, thin streaks of something dark, almost brown, that resisted washing. In her dreams, the plain she walked grew busier. She began to see shapes moving in the red haze tall, gaunt figures draped in strips of flesh, their faces obscured, their voices low and murmuring. She could never make out the words, but she woke each time with the taste of salt on her lips. Then came the letter. It arrived without a postmark, without a name, tucked beneath the door of the tavern one rainy evening. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting small and precise. It spoke of a phenomenon known to certain societies for centuries, a rare event called carno pluvia, the meat rain. According to the letter, it was no accident, but rather a sign that the veil between the realms has grown thin, and the offering is accepted. No further explanation was given, only an instruction. Do not discard what has fallen, for it marks you as chosen. The letter was shown to the preacher, who declared it blasphemy and burned it in the hearth before the eyes of a small crowd. But Elijah had read enough before the flames took it, and the words had lodged themselves in his mind. Chosen, offering, veil. He began to wonder whether the pieces that fell were not mere meat, but fragments of something greater, something alive. Margaret had her own thoughts. In her dreams, the gaunt figures had begun to speak more clearly. They spoke of hunger, of storms that fed upon the living, of rivers that ran not with water but with blood, thick enough to walk upon, and always they spoke of the next rain. It was during one of these nights that Margaret awoke to find the cedar box beneath her bed, empty. The linen wrapping lay crumpled, the salt scattered across the floorboards, and in the stillness of the room she thought she heard the faint patter of rain on the roof, though the sky outside was clear and full of stars. The morning after Margaret's cedar box was found empty, Olympia Springs awoke to a silence that felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that presses against the ears, making every creak of the floorboards, every breath, sound unnaturally loud. People went about their chores with eyes lowered, as if expecting the sky to betray them again at any moment. The dogs, once lively, now slunk close to the ground, tails tucked, noses twitching at scents too faint for human senses. By noon, a new unease had gripped the town. 3 children were missing siblings from the Harper family, last seen playing near the creek the previous evening. A search party was organized, lanterns bobbing through the fields and along the tree line. When the children were found, it was not in the way their parents had prayed for. They lay on the muddy bank, side by side, as though placed there deliberately. Their faces were pale, mouths slightly open, eyes fixed on the overcast sky. There were no wounds, no sign of struggle, but each child's lips were stained a dark, rusty red, as if they had been drinking from some hidden spring. The preacher tried to hold the funeral quickly, urging the townsfolk to put the matter behind them. But whispers spread quiet at first, then louder that the children had been fed something not of this earth. Margaret said nothing, but in the privacy of her home she felt an unmistakable certainty. The rain had returned, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those it had touched. Elijah was visited that night, or so he claimed later, when his voice shook and his eyes darted toward shadows no one else could see. He said he woke to find his hearth glowing faintly, though the fire had died hours before. Above the mantel, where the dried strip of meat had once hung, there now dangled something far larger, an unbroken length of flesh, coiling slowly in the air as though suspended in water. He swore it pulsed with a heartbeat not his own. Then, from somewhere just beyond the edge of sight, a voice spoke. "When the second rain comes, you will know where to stand." From that night on, Elijah began marking the ground outside his home. Strange patterns took shape, circles within circles, intersected by jagged lines. The children who wandered too close said they could hear a faint humming, though no one else could. Margaret, upon hearing this, felt her dreams grow more vivid. The gaunt figures in the red plain now stood closer to her. Their faces, half-revealed skin stretched thin, eyes deep as sinkholes. One of them extended a hand, and in it was the missing strip from her cedar box, but altered. It writhed like a living thing, its surface shimmering as if slick with fresh blood. Then, late one evening, a storm formed on the horizon. At first, it looked like any other rolling wall of cloud, heavy with rain. But as it drew closer, the clouds seemed to change shape, twisting into long rib-like arches that glowed faintly from within. The air grew thick, difficult to breathe, and the smell returned sharper this time, metallic and sweet, a perfume of rot that clung to the back of the throat. The townsfolk shuttered their windows and bolted their doors, but no rain came. Instead, in the dim light before dawn, a sound began low, distant, like the beating of a great wing. When the first piece fell, it struck the roof of the old schoolhouse with a sickening slap, then another, and another. Soon the town was drenched not in water, but in warm, quivering flesh. It slid down the walls, splattered on cobblestones, pooled in the gutters. The pieces were different this time. Some bore fine strands of hair, others had fragments of bone protruding at jagged angles. And in the midst of the downpour, the flies returned in swarms, their droning so loud it drowned out the cries of those who dared to run outside. But this was not like the first rain. There was purpose in it now. The pieces seemed to fall in patterns, forming lines and shapes across the town square, shapes eerily similar to those Elijah had carved into the dirt. He stood in the center of it, head tilted back, arms spread wide, his mouth open as if to drink from the sky. Margaret watched from her window, her hands trembling, torn between the terror in her chest and the pull of something calling her to join him. By the time the second rain stopped, the town was unrecognizable. The air shimmered with heat, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath the feet of those who still wandered. In the silence that followed, a single sound rose up, the deep, slow thud of a heartbeat, as if the very earth beneath Olympia Springs had begun to live. And then, without warning, the meat began to move. At first, it was subtle, a twitch here, a shiver there, as if the fallen flesh were merely reacting to the morning breeze. But soon the movements grew deliberate. Strips curled upon themselves like the unfurling of newborn fingers, while larger pieces shuddered and rolled toward one another, merging into shapeless masses. The townsfolk who had dared to remain outdoors stumbled back, their boots sinking into the warm, quaking ground. Somewhere nearby, a child screamed, the sound cutting short as quickly as it began. Elijah stood at the center of the square, motionless, his arms still spread wide. The lines of meat that had arranged themselves into patterns around him now pulsed in time with the heartbeat in the earth. Margaret saw it from her window. Each beat sent a ripple through the flesh, traveling inward toward him like a tide. And with each ripple, Elijah's body seemed to change, his skin tightening, his eyes sinking deeper, his lips parting in a smile that held no trace of the man she once knew. From the church, the preacher emerged, clutching a worn Bible, shouting verses into the windless air. His voice was steady for the first few lines, then cracked as the masses of meat began to rise, folding over themselves, building upward into something vaguely humanoid, but without symmetry. Limbs sprouted only to vanish, heads split open to reveal nothing but darkness, and through it all, the flies thickened until the sky seemed to writhe with them. Margaret felt the pull again, stronger than before, a deep, insistent throb in her chest, as if her heart were being tuned to match the rhythm beneath the ground. She gripped the windowsill so tightly her knuckles ached, yet part of her longed to step outside, to feel the warm rain on her skin once more. In her mind's eye, the red plain stretched endlessly before her, and the gaunt figures waited at its edge, their arms open in welcome. The preacher's voice faltered entirely when one of the masses lurched toward him. It did not walk, it simply slid, carried forward on unseen waves, until it enveloped him whole. There was no scream, no cry, only the sound of flesh folding over flesh, and then he was gone. Elijah, meanwhile, had begun to speak in a language no one recognized, a series of low, guttural tones that seemed to make the air vibrate. The shapes in the square responded, their movements growing faster, more precise, as if his words were giving them form. Margaret could no longer resist. She stepped out into the square, her bare feet sinking into the warm, slick patterns on the ground. Each step seemed to erase a layer of fear, replacing it with a strange clarity. This was not a curse, nor an accident. It was a reclamation, a return, and she was part of it. Elijah turned to her, his eyes black as the deepest pit, and gestured for her to come closer. As she reached him, the clouds above began to churn, their rib-like shapes closing overhead, until the sky was sealed away. The heartbeat grew so loud it drowned every other sound, even the endless droning of the flies. Then, in the instant before the darkness closed entirely, Margaret understood. The rain had never fallen from the sky. It had risen. From beneath, the ground beneath Olympia Springs split open, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the slow, deliberate parting of something alive. Heat surged upward, carrying with it a stench so thick it clung to the inside of the throat. And from that yawning wound in the earth came a light knot, bright but deep, the color of blood seen through closed eyelids. Shapes began to emerge from it, vast and indistinct, their outlines shifting as though they were still deciding what to be. Margaret took Elijah's hand. Together they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into that light. The air inside was heavy, like walking into a lung mid-breath. She could hear voices all around her now, no longer in dreams but here, real and close. They spoke of a cycle, of rains that came once in a generation, marking those who would be taken and those who would remain. She did not know which she had been chosen for, only that she would not return. When the light faded and the ground sealed itself once more, the square was empty. The meat was gone. The flies had vanished. Only the pattern remained, etched deep into the stone, still warm to the touch. The remaining townsfolk avoided it, yet none dared destroy it. They did not speak of Elijah or Margaret again, at least not openly. But at night, when the wind died and the stars hung low, some swore they could hear it, the soft patter of something falling, far off in the distance, drawing slowly nearer. And in the years to come, long after Olympia Springs was abandoned, travelers passing through would find the square untouched by time. They would stand in its center, feeling the faint pulse beneath their feet, and wonder what had happened there. Most would leave quickly, but just a few would linger, and sometimes, when the air was still, those few would swear the sky had darkened for just a moment. and that the taste of salt had risen unbidden to their tongues.